In an era where global alliances are shifting like tectonic plates beneath our feet, few developments have struck with as much force as Iran's recent military alignment with Russia. The sudden presence of Iranian bombers on Moscow's soil is more than a political gesture. It is a calculated demonstration of power, purpose, and defiance. This moment doesn't exist in isolation. It is part of a broader, more complex narrative unfolding before our eyes. One that speaks to the erosion of traditional boundaries, the rise of unpredictable partnerships, and the resurgence of Cold War-level tensions in a world that had hoped it had outgrown them. What makes this particular event so profoundly unsettling isn't just the military optics. It's the layered implications. The whispers from the Kremlin hinting at potential nuclear cooperation with Iran, the silent recalibrations being made in Western intelligence hubs, and the anxious pace at which diplomatic actors are now moving to reassess their strategic assumptions. This is not merely about jets landing or statements being made. It is about the quiet, creeping possibility of a new global order taking shape. One less defined by established rules and more shaped by raw ambition and ideological opposition. To ignore these developments is to willfully blind oneself to the rising tide of instability, and yet to overreact would be to fall into the trap that this very alliance may be designed to provoke. We are, all of us, participants in a geopolitical drama where silence is strategic, moves are layered, and every headline hints at deeper truths. The Iran-Russia military coordination is not just a message, it is a test of Western resolve, a challenge to diplomatic norms, and perhaps most dangerously, a signal that some of the world's most volatile powers are no longer content to sit at the periphery. But we are not witnessing just the evolution of military ties, we are witnessing the redefinition of global alliances. And in that redefinition lies a threat, not only to peace, but to the fragile trust that keeps our interconnected world from unraveling. The developments between Tehran and Moscow are not simply news, they are warnings. And the question that remains is, will we listen before the next step is no longer reversible? You have to understand that when a nation like Iran lands bombers in Moscow, it's not just about aircraft or military logistics. It's an ideological signal, one that transcends geography and politics and enters into the realm of psychological warfare. It's a declaration of solidarity against what they perceive to be a common adversary. And it's a move that reshapes the narrative of power dynamics in a rapidly destabilizing world. These aren't isolated acts. These are moves made by deeply calculated minds, actors playing on a global chessboard, where the stakes are existential. Iran has long perceived itself as a sovereign actor encircled by hostility, sanctions, surveillance, threats of intervention. In that psychological environment, the human response is predictable but still profound. One seeks allies not necessarily because they are virtuous, but because they share an enemy. That's what's happening here. This alliance with Russia isn't merely strategic in the military sense. It's psychological alignment. It's Iran saying to the world, we will not be isolated. If the West won't accept us on their terms, then we'll write new terms with new partners. And this is not a new story in history. When you isolate a power, when you dismiss it as a pariah, you trigger a natural reaction. It begins to forge alliances with others who feel similarly marginalized. That's precisely what we're watching unfold. What makes this dangerous is not just the military hardware or the coordination of airspace. What makes this dangerous is the philosophical congruence that underpins it. Russia and Iran share more than strategic interests. They share a resentment of Western moralism, a disdain for globalist norms that they view as hypocritical and corrosive to national sovereignty. Think for a moment about the psychological effect of being dismissed repeatedly on the world stage. For years, Iran has been caricatured as a rogue, a threat, a problem to be managed. What happens when a nation internalizes that? It either fractures under the pressure or transforms the contempt into defiant ambition. Iran chose the latter, and now it's found in Russia, not just a military partner, but a kindred spirit. Both operate from a narrative of reclamation, reclaiming power, dignity, and a seat at the table of global influence. Now consider what it means for Russia to welcome Iranian bombers on its soil. This is a power that was not long ago engaged in tactical balancing acts across the Middle East, sometimes cooperating with Iran, sometimes pushing back. But the calculus has changed. Sanctions, economic isolation, and a war in Ukraine have driven Moscow to reconsider who its true allies are. In Iran, it sees a partner willing to push back against the same ideological front. They both resist Western expansion, culturally, economically. This growing alliance is not just tactical, it's symbolic. It tells the world, and particularly the West, that multipolarity isn't coming. It's already here. And here's the tragic irony. The more the West reacts with condemnation, the more it validates the narrative that Iran and Russia feed to their people, that the world is out to subjugate them, that their resistance is righteous, even heroic. You don't neutralize a threat like that with military might or moral outrage. You neutralize it by understanding the emotional and psychological terrain that gives rise to it in the first place. And so if you think what's happening in Moscow with those bombers is just another news headline, you're missing the broader story. You're missing the emergence of a new psychological architecture, one where alliances are formed not just through treaties and economics, but through a shared story of grievance, a shared myth of redemption, and a shared enemy to unite against. That's the engine driving this deepening bond between Tehran and Moscow. The West must now decide, does it continue to isolate, sanction, and punish in hopes that submission will follow? Or does it reimagine a diplomatic framework that takes seriously the internal logic of those it calls adversaries? That doesn't mean agreeing with them. It means understanding that every action, even one as provocative as Iranian bombers on Russian soil, emerges from a worldview that must be contended with, not merely dismissed. Here's the reality we all have to wrestle with. History isn't just made by those in power. It's shaped by those who feel unheard, those who are told over and over again that their voice, their culture, their sovereignty doesn't matter. When you push people like that to the edge, they don't vanish. They consolidate, they rearm, they return with alliances that defy prediction and reshape the world's trajectory. This alliance between Iran and Russia, fueled by strategy, resentment, and a thirst for relevance, is one of the clearest signs that we're not returning to a stable unipolar order anytime soon. And if we fail to take this seriously, not just politically, but psychologically, we will find ourselves reacting to history rather than shaping it. In a world where contempt becomes fuel and isolation becomes armor, the bonds formed in resistance may become the very engines of global upheaval. The question now is not whether we can stop it, but whether we understand it well enough to even try. There is something profoundly unsettling, almost primal, about nuclear signaling. It transcends the logic of policy debates and military calculations and strikes directly at the psyche. When the Kremlin hints, even subtly, at the use or consideration of nuclear capabilities, it's not simply engaging in geopolitical theater. It's wielding fear as a psychological instrument, a way of influencing behavior not by force, but by the anticipation of catastrophic consequences. And when fear becomes the mechanism of control, you're no longer dealing with rational negotiation. You're dealing with a form of psychological coercion. This is what makes nuclear signaling uniquely potent in the modern era. It's not just about the weapons themselves. It's about what they represent in the deepest recesses of the human mind: annihilation, helplessness, apocalypse. When Iran aligns itself with a nation like Russia, which has the capability and the historical willingness to brandish that kind of existential threat, the implications are both strategic and symbolic. It changes the emotional atmosphere of global politics. It injects uncertainty into every calculation, because suddenly you're no longer playing a game with known boundaries. You're engaging in a contest where one side keeps moving the edge of the cliff closer to your feet. Now imagine the Kremlin's intent here. It's not necessarily to start a war. It may not even be to use these weapons at all. But the mere suggestion, the slight shift in tone, the calculated ambiguity creates a ripple effect of doubt, hesitation, and overcorrection among adversaries. That's power. Not kinetic power, and that's far more dangerous because it causes people to second guess not just their strategies, but their principles, their alliances, even their sense of reality. You can't fight fear with facts. Not really. Because fear operates in a different part of the mind. It bypasses rational analysis and attaches itself to images, to stories, to hypotheticals. And so when a state like Russia invokes nuclear capabilities, especially in a context where it has aligned with a volatile but ideologically driven partner like Iran, it changes the terms of engagement. It introduces a kind of moral vertigo. It makes you wonder, what are we really dealing with here? Are we still in the realm of diplomacy, or have we crossed into something far darker, far more unpredictable? What's particularly significant about this moment is how Iran plays into this. By standing beside a nuclear power that openly challenges Western norms, Iran isn't just seeking protection, it's seeking psychological amplification. It's using Russia's nuclear muscle to embolden its own geopolitical posture. It's a bit like a smaller, but fiercely determined fighter stepping into the ring with a larger, more dangerous ally at his back. That dynamic doesn't just intimidate, it emboldens. It gives permission to act more aggressively, to speak more defiantly, to dream more dangerously. And this is where the West often makes its mistake. It assumes that fear will lead to deterrence, that by raising the stakes, adversaries will back down. But the truth is far more complex. For some regimes, fear doesn't suppress ambition, it justifies it. It creates a narrative of survival, of self-defense, of righteous resistance. In that mindset, fear isn't something to be avoided. It's something to be projected outward, weaponized. If you're living under the shadow of destruction, why not cast that shadow on your enemies, too? Now, let's be honest. The mere existence of nuclear weapons is a moral paradox. They promise peace through terror, stability through the threat of annihilation. It's the ultimate psychological contradiction. We keep ourselves safe by holding the power to destroy ourselves. When Russia makes that power part of its public messaging, especially when it has an audience like Iran watching closely, it's not just managing military balance. It's manipulating emotional reality. It's saying, we're willing to go further than you. Are you prepared for that? That question, are you prepared, is what defines the psychological battle now underway. It's not about military superiority. It's about mental fortitude. It's about who can tolerate more uncertainty, who can absorb more risk, who can operate more effectively in a world without clear rules. That's where Iran and Russia believe they have an edge. Because while the West debates, delays, and deliberates, they act. Not always wisely, but decisively. And that decisiveness, paired with nuclear ambiguity, is a psychological force multiplier. So where does that leave the rest of us? It leaves us in a position where clarity of thought is no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. You can't navigate a world like this with platitudes and idealism. You need a philosophy that confronts evil without becoming it. A courage that doesn't overreact but also doesn't retreat into denial. And most importantly, a psychological strength that recognizes fear for what it is. Not just a feeling, but a tool. One that can be used against you, or, if understood properly, one that can be neutralized. The Kremlin isn't just hinting at war. It's reminding the world that the rules are fragile, that the systems we depend on are built on consensus, not inevitability. And when consensus fractures, when fear replaces order, the descent into chaos is never far behind. So here's what we must understand and remember. In a world ruled increasingly by the psychology of fear, the most radical act is to remain grounded, to resist manipulation, to think clearly, and to act from strength rather than panic. Because if we don't master fear, it will surely master us. When a geopolitical shock reverberates through the international order, like the image of bombers over Moscow, or a Kremlin whisper of nuclear support, it doesn't simply rattle governments. It reveals something far more profound. The fragility of the alliances we've spent decades building, and the underlying crisis of trust that has slowly eroded their foundation. Now, trust is a strange phenomenon. It's invisible yet indispensable. It's what allows nations to collaborate, coordinate, and commit. Without trust, treaties are just paper. Negotiations are just theater, and words are little more than noise. And right now, what we're seeing across the world isn't just a diplomatic scramble. It's the unraveling of relational capital among so-called allies. When Iran makes a move that shocks the world, aligning itself more boldly with a nuclear-inclined Kremlin, it sends a clear message. It's not interested in playing by the existing rules. But what's more interesting is the reaction to that move. And that's where the fragmentation becomes visible. Because instead of a unified front, what we observe is a cacophony of contradictory responses. Statements of concern from some, silence from others, and opportunistic positioning by the rest. Why? Because the old lines are blurring. The moral clarity that once guided international responses is being replaced by something else. Doubt, self-interest, hesitation. And this isn't just a matter of political convenience. It's a psychological phenomenon. Nations, like individuals, operate in hierarchies of value. They prioritize survival, stability, and power. But when the world becomes unpredictable, when norms break down and threats become diffuse, those values begin to compete. One country values trade, another values ideology. One values security, another values narrative control. And so instead of a symphony of cooperation, you get discord. You get fragmented alliances, nations pulling in opposite directions, while pretending they're on the same side. This is how trust breaks, not as a single dramatic betrayal, but in a slow accumulation of inconsistencies. When one ally hedges their statements, when another abstains from a critical vote, when promises made behind closed doors are replaced with public ambiguity. It's like a relationship strained by silence, not by what is said, but by what's not said, by what is withheld. And if trust erodes long enough, fear rushes in to fill the gap. Fear of abandonment, fear of betrayal, fear of being left to deal with the threat alone. And that fear, more than ideology or strategy, is what drives nations to seek new partnerships, even if those partnerships are dangerous, even if they're unstable. Because in a world where no one is sure who will stand by them tomorrow, today's enemy can start to look like a safer bet than yesterday's ally. Iran understands this. It understands that the global order isn't held together by power alone. It's held together by perception, by the belief that order still matters, that promises still count, that someone, somewhere, is keeping the flame of principle alive. And so, by aligning with Russia in a way that openly defies those assumptions, Iran isn't just shaking a fist at the West. It's exploiting a deeper fracture. It's pointing to the cracks and saying, see, they're not who they claim to be. Their unity is a facade. And disturbingly, they're not wrong. But look around. NATO is strained. The UN is paralyzed. The EU is politically fragmented. Even bilateral relationships that once seemed unshakable are now marked by skepticism. And while policymakers debate economic sanctions and military containment, the real issue continues to grow beneath the surface, the issue of relational decay, the slow, corrosive loss of mutual belief in one another's integrity. The truth is, trust once broken doesn't easily return. It has to be rebuilt with honesty, consistency, and courage. It requires nations to take risks, to say the hard things, to draw lines that mean something. But that kind of moral clarity is in short supply, because moral clarity demands cost. It demands sacrifice. And in an era obsessed with short-term outcomes, long-term credibility becomes a luxury few are willing to afford. So when Iran acts boldly and the West responds with fragmented rhetoric, it doesn't just weaken the diplomatic position, it erodes the very psychology of deterrence. Because deterrence, at its core, isn't just about capability, it's about conviction. It's about making your adversary believe you mean what you say. And if you no longer believe that about your own allies, why would your enemies believe it about you? This is where we find ourselves now, in a global landscape where fear has replaced faith, where hesitation has replaced resolve, and where the concept of alliance is being quietly replaced by that of expedience. It's a dangerous place to be, because once trust is gone, all that's left is power. And when power becomes the only language left to speak, history has shown us again and again, disaster is often not far behind. So here's the question we must all wrestle with. In a world that's increasingly uncertain, do we have the courage to rebuild trust? Not with mere words, but with consistent action. Because if we continue to prioritize convenience over conviction, then the fragmentation we see now will only deepen until the idea of unity is not just broken, but forgotten. When global powers shift, when alliances crack and old orders begin to collapse, it's tempting to focus exclusively on the geopolitical implications, but to overlook the psychological impact, the individual and collective mindset that arises in such moments, is to miss the deeper and often more dangerous undercurrent shaping the future. At the heart of this latest geopolitical tremor, triggered by Iran's growing proximity to Russia and symbolized most violently by the specter of bombers in Moscow, is a profound and unsettling truth. People are losing their cognitive anchors. For decades, we've been trained to see the world through a relatively stable moral framework. There were allies and enemies, good actors and rogue states, predictable moves and understandable motives. But now, those categories are dissolving, and that kind of moral and cognitive disorientation is not something a society moves through without consequence. In psychology, we understand the importance of narrative. Human beings construct meaning through stories about who they are, what their country stands for, what their leaders represent. These aren't trivial or decorative. They are structurally necessary. They give coherence to experience. And when those stories are disrupted, people don't just get confused. They become anxious, paranoid, cynical, or even nihilistic. Consider the average citizen, watching headlines evolve from distant rumors into existential alarms. Yesterday, Iran was contained. Today, it's potentially nuclear armed, backed by a resurgent Kremlin and operating with an audacity the West seems unable or unwilling to check. What does that do to the psyche of a person who believed the world was largely in order, that institutions still functioned, that rational diplomacy could manage risk? Well, it does what trauma always does. It introduces chaos into what used to be predictable. And chaos, unless confronted honestly and courageously, breeds pathology. It manifests in extremism, tribalism, blind nationalism, or total despair. It infects political discourse. It escalates polarization. It undermines the shared sense of truth required for any democracy to function. You start to see this across the board. Nations questioning not just their adversaries, but themselves. Citizens questioning the legitimacy of their own governments. People defaulting into conspiracies not because they're inherently irrational, but because the world around them has stopped making coherent sense. And here's where it gets more dangerous. In times of moral confusion, power becomes seductive. Strong men rise not just because they promise action, but because they provide certainty. And when people are drowning in complexity, certainty, even the brutal kind, feels like rescue. So when Iran walks boldly into the global theater with its chest out, backed by nuclear insinuations and Kremlin support, it's not just engaging in a power play, it's selling a narrative of strength, of conviction, of defiance against a West that increasingly appears fractured, unsure, or hollow in its declarations. If we fail to grasp that this is as much a psychological war as it is a strategic one, we risk losing in ways we won't see until it's too late. Because bombs and treaties can be tracked and analyzed, but the slow corrosion of meaning, that's silent. That's invisible. Until suddenly, it's everywhere. And at that point, no amount of military readiness will compensate for a population that no longer believes in the values it's being told to defend. This is not a call for hysteria. It's a call for psychological clarity. The kind that acknowledges that human beings cannot thrive in chaos, cannot operate morally in confusion, and cannot preserve civilization on the basis of rhetoric alone. What's required now is not just geopolitical strategy, it's moral rejuvenation, a collective, honest reckoning with who we are, what we believe, and what we're willing to endure in order to protect that belief. The West wants to remain a meaningful force, not just militarily, but spiritually. It must speak a language deeper than press releases. It must embody the virtues it claims to stand for: integrity, courage, clarity, humility. That means admitting when things are broken. That means treating citizens not like consumers of narratives, but like adults capable of bearing difficult truths. That means recognizing that in the face of global realignment, the greatest danger is not the weapons our enemies possess, but the confusion our own people carry within. Because when meaning collapses, manipulation thrives. When truth becomes optional, the loudest liar wins. And when courage is replaced by convenience, The civilization you thought was permanent starts to dissolve, first in principle and then in fact. So we stand at a crossroads, not just in policy, but in spirit. Will we double down on distraction, on the easy comforts of political theater, or will we do the harder work of rebuilding coherence in a world drifting into narrative collapse? Because make no mistake, Iran's boldness is not just a political maneuver. It's a test of our resolve, not just as nations, but as individuals committed to a world where truth still matters, where alliances still mean something, and where chaos doesn't get the final word. And the outcome of that test won't be determined by missiles or diplomacy alone. It will be determined by whether we still have the courage to see clearly, speak honestly, and act decisively before the psychological ground beneath us gives way completely. What we're witnessing today is far more than a geopolitical power shift or the latest tremor in the fragile balance of global affairs. What we are witnessing is the slow unveiling of deeper fault lines within nations, within leadership, and most critically, within the human spirit. The headlines may scream of bombs, deadlines, alliances, and betrayals, but beneath all that noise lies a far more profound question. Who are we becoming in the face of escalating uncertainty? Iran's rising boldness, the Kremlin's ominous signals, and the fraying posture of the West aren't isolated events. They are symptoms of a broader crisis, a moral, psychological, and spiritual vacuum that is spreading across the globe. It's not enough to analyze policy or predict military responses. We must return to something older and more vital, a clear sense of truth, a grounded understanding of dignity, and a firm commitment to moral clarity, even when the world around us grows more chaotic. In times like these, courage is not only found in war rooms or political chambers. It is found in the soul of the individual who refuses to be swept away by confusion or seduced by false strength. It is found in leaders who speak with integrity, not volume. And it is found in people who resist the temptation to turn a blind eye, who choose instead to confront the uncomfortable, to ask the difficult questions, and to demand better, not just from governments, but from themselves. This is a time to awaken, not to panic, not to surrender to cynicism, but to awaken to the weight of our responsibility in shaping what comes next. History will not be kind to those who watched the world tilt toward disorder and chose silence. But it may yet remember those who stood firm, who refused to trade truth for convenience, and who understood that in an age of deception, clarity itself becomes an act of rebellion. So let us not conclude in fear, but in resolve. The kind of resolve that understands peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of vision. And if we still carry even a spark of that vision within us, now is the time to fan it into flame. Because the future isn't waiting, it's watching.